Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought today I would do a video basically looking at some ideas which, to be honest, I would like to see as the World War Mode Season 3 prizes. One of the things that has been very good about World War Mode, especially since the second season, is the way that they've done their prizes, with stuff like the Phelps and also the BA-11. It was really nice to see two World War vehicles for a World War II mode. Now this time, we're entering the Cold War period, so it's much more apt to have a look at some Cold War vehicles. So what I've done is I picked some, well, technically Cold War vehicles from the time period and tried to stick in the time period that this, the information that we have has actually given us. So the first thing that we know is that the overall operation is going to be called Way to the West, which makes sense since it seems to be based around the Soviet, or the alternate history, Soviet invasion of Western Europe and other things. And we also know that it's going to involve Arab-Israeli conflicts. On top of this, we also have a date, the 25th of July 1985. So I've had a look at this date and tried to fit vehicles around it. And also, I focused on ground vehicles and also helicopters. The main reason for this is the first World War mode, the season that we've had with helicopters, so therefore it makes sense if we have some kind of prize for helicopters, just like the last one where we had a naval prize, since of course it was a naval based World War mode. The other thing as well is I didn't want to put in any airplanes because, well, we're talking about the 1980s here. This would either be similar or even better than vehicles that we already have in the game at 10.3. And I don't think a 10.3 premium for any nation is good, so therefore that is scrapped. And also no naval stuff because there wasn't really any naval conflicts during the Cold War. I'm sure in alternate history there maybe, but yeah, in the Arab-Israeli conflicts and the Cold War period, also the battle for Fulda Gap, there isn't really anywhere to put any naval units, so therefore we're focusing on ground and helicopter stuff. There's also a few personal little things that I wanted to throw in here as well, just vehicles that I would like to see which do fit the time period, but they're a little bit off. And the first one is this little boy. This is the Sparpanzer SP1C. And what is the SP1C? Well, what it is a vehicle I would have liked to see for a long time in game. I always thought it would be a nice tech tree equivalent to something like an RU-251 or something similar. And what it is a prototype or an experimental model of a light tank for Germany. It was supposed to be a West German reconnaissance vehicle, which had anti-tank components, very similar to how France and also other countries such as Germany and even Britain with stuff like the Weasel tried to create something which was incredibly light, incredibly mobile, and would be able to be used not just in a recon role but also kind of pretty decently in an anti-tank role. The SP1C had a 90mm on it. It was known as the Makar, and it could fire Heat FS and also some AP or APCR. Now it's very similar to the Cockerel gun, where pretty much you just lob shells at things but at a much lower velocity, and this thing weighs less than 10 tons. It has absolutely no armor on it. We're literally talking about 10 to 15 millimeters, and because it is so light and because it is supposed to be pretty quick, the actual power plant that this thing has is a Hotchkiss 7-cylinder benzene machine with 154 horsepower, giving it around about 30 horsepower per ton. So this thing could motor around if it really felt like it. So for me, when I have a look at it, its max speed being 60 kilometers an hour, and also unfortunately, it never really made it into service. There was only really one prototype built. There was also a few plans for some other ones, but, let's obviously not go into them. This one is still surviving. It is still around the place. And yeah, it would just really be nice to see the SP1C, just to have that around about 6'7" light vehicle. That would be similar to the RU-251 in stature, since the RU-251 hasn't really had an equivalent for a long time. And yes, I know they added the Bulldog in the tech tree, but I still don't see that as a real equivalent, since it's just very similar to the American vehicle with some Heat FS. The next vehicle that would be nice to see as a event vehicle for World War mode is this little guy. And this is much more akin to the time period and also akin to the nations. Something I also took into account was the nations that were involved in a lot of the conflicts. So we have Germany, we have the Soviet Union, we have America, we have France, and we also have some other stuff, like when it comes to slightly other nations. And also stuff like Syria, places like that. And the reason why we have stuff like America and France is because obviously their vehicles were very, very much used in stuff such as the Yom Kippur War, which was a little bit before the 80s, which is, at least the time period where they've kind of set because of the date they gave. And another vehicle for Germany is the Weasel, AWC. And this vehicle was produced between 1979 and went into the 90s. And what it is an AFV, or an armored fighting vehicle. It's a pretty simple one. It's an air transportable little buggy, I suppose you would call it, and it has normally a crew of 2. And the whole idea of it was to try and give the same size, form, and features of an early tankette, which would be able to be used for reconnaissance, would be able to support infantry, and be able to give some anti-tank power to machines without having to have these massive MBTs running around. Just a little support vehicle which could be used by airborne troops to give themselves a little bit more power on the battlefield instead of having to deal with infantry weapons. So this version that you see here is the Weasel 1 ATM TOW, and it's just the Weasel fitted with a TOW missile. There were other versions as well, such as one which was had access to the Rheinmetall MK20 RH202 20mm autocannon, and there's also the Weasel 2. Now, the Weasel 2 is a stretched version of the Weasel 1. It has the same amount of crew, and they also made some different versions of it. One which was an it was an anti-air machine, showing that, at least when it came to the Weasel, they were happy with it and wanted to try and expand its ideas. But I want to stick with the Weasel 1 just because it fits better with the time period. This would be another one which would just be completely useless in terms of armor, but when it comes to the engine, you got a 5-cylinder inline turbo diesel. It'd give you about 86 horsepower, but the machine itself is less than 3 tons, so it can actually motor around at 70 kilometers an hour. It would be really annoying to fight this thing, but I tell you what, it would be really fun to play, and that is something to always consider. The next vehicle is a simple one once again. So I've been doing a ton of reading the last few days, maybe the last week or so, about a lot of the Israel conflicts. And the reason for this is not just to kind of understand, what may come for World War mode, but to be honest, there isn't really a ton that I've personally read about it. When it comes to Israel as a country, I'm not well versed on it, because we were never really taught in school. It was never really brought up, and it seems to be something that is talked a lot about, in America, and, its history and the things like this, and there seems to be some kind of special connection between Israel and America, but where I was brought up, it wasn't even really in the conscience at all. So it's been interesting reading a lot about certain battles which happened, and one thing I kept thinking in my head is, of course, the Yom Kippur War, which was incredibly important, I suppose, when we talk about the what Israel is today. The Yom Kippur War happening, of course, in 1973 in October, and there was a battle, the Golan Heights, and I couldn't get it out my head that the Golan Heights were actually called the Silo Heights, but obviously the Silo Heights was in World War II, just on the east side of Berlin, and it's just, I don't know, I just get them confused a lot. And there's so many really interesting stories, especially from the Yom Kippur War and many others, of tankers which were incredibly important in holding specific areas. and being able to fight night and day over and over again, not just, of course, on the Israel side, but also on the Syrian side of things. And it's something that I think should be shown in the game. Whether that is you give Israel some kind of like a shot, which of course is the tank that you see in the picture. It's the Centurion tank with the L7-105. It's obviously massively upgraded. We have the Shock Cal Dallet already in the game with the extra ERA armor and obviously the new stabilizer system and everything like this. But if you just give them like a standard shot, so a standard Centurion with a few of the bells and whistles, such as you could put in the Shot Meteor, which was it was basically the standard one with the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine. You could add in like the Shock Cal LF or something like that, which gave it a better engine, or maybe even just a version of the Shock Cal Dallet that we already have, but it's, as I said, it's something that represents a historical figure. There are many combat veterans which you could celebrate by giving them a specific vehicle, like their specific vehicle that was used during the conflict, and I think it would just be nice to do that to, as I said, celebrate that part of history, and it's something that I hope happens with War Thunder going forward. Very similar to some of the old ideas, such as Rasmussen's P-36A or Pekrishkin's P-39, or stuff such as that. There are many vehicles in game which are really cool, and the fact that they tie back to historical figures makes it not just interesting, but also it gives people a historical edge, meaning that they can have a look at that person, they can see what's going on, why is this person famous, what did they do, in World War II, or what did they do in any conflict, and it would be nice to see that celebrated through this World War Mode 2. The next vehicle is French. Now, this one's a little bit of a wild card, kind of like the SP-1C, and the reason why it's a wild card is because, yes, Israel did use French vehicles. Yes, there was also some French which would have been involved in stuff, such as if, the Soviets had come across the Fulda Gap and invaded West Germany, but at the same time, if we're looking at the overall picture, the vehicle that I'm proposing would not have been a vehicle which would have involved in any of these things. This is the AMX 13105, a Model 58, and this was made in the early 70s, and what it is an upgraded AMX. We have in game the AMX 1375, we have the AMX 1390, but we don't have the AMX 13105. Instead, what we have is the Char 25T, which of course was a prototype and a very good prototype of that. But I would just like to see this AMX 13105 just because it would be nice to finish off the AMX 13 series with a bang. It has a 105mm L44 mounted in the FL12 turret. It also had a thermal sleeve on the gun, which is always nice, and it could store 32 rounds. 12 rounds in the autoloader, very similar configuration to all of the other AMX 13s with this style of turret, and pretty much you had a 280 horsepower diesel engine, the Baudouin, and this gave it increased top speed to 65 kilometers an hour, had an automatic transmission, and also it could have the possibility, depending on how it was produced, obviously this was kind of a prototype at the time, you could give it hydropneumatic suspension if you wanted to, so you could go bouncy. There was a bunch of AMX 13105s which were actually used by a ton of different countries, but not by France. And it's just one of those interesting ones. Like you have a Dutch AMX 13105, you have stuff such as an Indonesian one, you have ones which were used by Ecuador. It was a heavily exported vehicle, which is really interesting. But one specific one that I do want to point out, if we don't want to have a look at the French one, is the German one. Now, this is obviously slightly different. from the standard AMX 13105, but this is the DF-105. This is a mid-1980s tank destroyer, which was designed with the FL-15 turret with the 105mm gun, and it's on the Marder 1 chassis, the Marder 1 IFV. Now, we already have the chassis in game. It's on stuff like the Florak Panzer, which is obviously the ground-to-air SAM system for Germany. Why not have something like this on the Marder chassis? It looks really interesting. It's obviously got a SOP TAC fire control system, has a laser rangefinder, has the 105mm gun, of course. The actual turret itself is, as I said, the FL-15 turret, which was just a further development of the FL-12 turret, so it just made it a little bit better. Not exactly sure if it had a stabilizer, because of course the whole idea of the turrets didn't really... It's kind of hard to fit a stabilizer in it, let's just put it like that, because it was designed to be very small. And it could fire pretty much anything you wanted. It could also carry 50 rounds of ammunition, obviously the 12 rounds per minute rate of fire, so fire every 5 seconds, and it would have HE, HEAP, heat, APDS, and even APFS-DS out of this machine. It was also powered by a 720 horsepower engine, just like the TAM system that we already have in game. So this thing would be incredibly deadly, definitely a lot of fun, and it would be lovely to see if they wanted to give Germany something with a bit of spice and trying to combine not just Germany but also France. The next vehicle I want to look at is a helicopter, and it was kind of hard looking for helicopters. After having a look at, as I said, the airplane stuff, I was like, nope, this this ain't gonna work. There are a lot of the planes that would have been used in this conflict are just out of the question, and the helicopter usage was pretty much just transport helicopters, and this is one of them, but this one has extra capabilities which make it really interesting. This is the MIL Mi-8, and the Mi-8 is a medium twin-turbine helicopter. It was designed by the Soviet Union, it's built by the Soviet Union, and its main role is a transport helicopter, but it was also used as an airborne command post, it was used as a gunship, and also a reconnaissance platform. And if you want to know how this thing actually relates to this. So during the Yom Kippur War, once again in October 1973, the Syrians landed special forces troops behind Israel Defense Forces on the Golan Heights at Mount Hermon, Tel Fez, Vaset, Nafash, and also Ein Zivan. And there you go. So it was used as a transport helicopter to get people to the battlefield and get behind the enemy lines, which is pretty cool. Now, also another reason why I've picked this one is because it's one of the only transport helicopters used during any of the wars which had armed, which could be armed. A lot of the other ones are either in the game already, and or just did not have any armament. So therefore the Mi-8 is slightly different. It had storage to carry 4,000 kilos worth of bombs on 6 hard points. It could include 57. The hard points could carry S5 rockets of the 57mm variety. Then it could also carry Phalange ATGMs or even PK machine guns. So you've got the standard bombs, rockets, missiles, or guns, and I think that would be very nice to see. Obviously, this machine is a very standard helicopter. It would be a machine which is different compared to what we've seen in the game, and since the fact that nothing else really is around unless you wanted to put in a very, very aggressive attack helicopter, I think this would actually be a very nice thing to see. The next vehicle is, of course, this tank. Now, this tank is a little bit off the wall as well, but it would be involved in an alternate history conflict around the area once again. Now, this tank's origin is Egyptian, kind of. This is the Ramses II. Now, the reason why I picked the Ramses II is I think it's one of the more interesting vehicles of the area, especially for Egypt, and the way to describe it is this is a heavily modernized version of the T-54, T-55 series of vehicles. And when I mean heavily modernized, I mean we literally don't really know what's inside of this thing, and when it comes to like its armor values or when it comes to its protection. Like, we know it has active armor, obviously, you can see it. Passive armor protection, who knows? We know it exists, but that's about it. So let's talk about the story of the Ramses II. This is a very modern tank. 2005 was when it started its service, obviously designed in the 90s. But one of the things to understand is its base is very old. As I said, the base of this tank was a single T-34. This was a conglomeration effort between the Egyptian government and also a private company, which was known in November of 1984 as Teledyne Continental Motors, which eventually became General Motors Land Systems, or was taken over by them, and they were given a T-54 tank under contract to basically work on the mobility and firepower of the machine. Now, it wasn't just as simple as that, because at the time, the Egyptians used the M60A3. The M60A3, obviously the M60 series, heavily exported across the world, for good reason. It's an incredibly good vehicle and does fit a lot of countries' general systems when it comes to their tank combat doctrine. The other thing, because of this, they had M60A3s, the Egyptians were heavily interested in trying to have a lot of the same parts used for both vehicles, so therefore if one of them broke down, it would be much easier to fix it. Instead of having two different sets of parts, you would just have one of them, so therefore, you know, as I said, just easier to fix, and also just easier to store as well, the extra parts. So therefore they wanted a system which was similar to the M60A3, or the upgrades, sorry, should be similar to what the M60A3 had. So while improving the firepower and mobility, what they did was they added stuff such as the 105mm M68 rifled cannon, which of course the gun of the M60. So, you know, once again, using a same or similar system. When it comes to the mobility, it uses a TCM AVDS 1795A. This is a turbocharged diesel. It gives you 908 horsepower, and it has 80% commonality when it comes to the engine installed on the M60A3. So once again, easier to fix, once again, easier to deal with. Here is another picture of it showing some interesting stuff, right? Because of course, when you add a new engine system, or when you add a new system overall, what you have to do is you have to change the base of the vehicle, which is basically what you see here. They added an additional road wheel to the system, and also, as I said, they added the M68 cannon, which is exactly the same as what's used on the M60A3 in Egyptian service. They added the SABCA Titan Mark I system. It's a laser fire control system, so once again, in-game would have a laser rangefinder. And when it comes to the protection, it has a modern NBC overpressure system, which is pretty cool, but generally in-game, it would probably have similar armor values to a T-55 or a T-54. So what we have here is just a really souped up T-54, is pretty much the way to see it. And it would be nice to see in the game, because generally I don't think it would be too high of a BR. One of the problems with talking about 80s and 90s vehicles is a lot of them would be, you know, up there at the 10.3 standard, where I think the Ramses II, depending on what country you wanted to give it to, because you could technically give it to the Soviets, you could technically give it to the Americans if you wanted. It's one of those which I don't think would be in the top echelons. It would probably be around 83, 87, and therefore a pretty nice little deal. But yeah, those are the vehicles. I'm at least predicting to see some of them when it comes to the World War Mode rewards for Season 3. If we get some other stuff, I would love to see that too, and hopefully they keep the challenge system from the last World War Mode, which was so popular with the players. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Battling Bacon, Blackie, Chris Giltnane, Conte Baraka, Daniel Stanton, Elove Goat, Jay Wilt, Martinez, Trigger Hippie, Universe, Eugens Terry, and also I'm Devilish and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.